Hello and welcome to this March 9th, 2022 edition of ACFCS's interview series, Emerging Risks. This series takes a look at what's happening within the financial crime and compliance world and asks our expert members for their take on how to tackle these issues. This episode is Compliance Regulations and Russia. What are we missing? I am Erin O'Loughlin, Senior Director of Training for ACFCS. We begin this episode with a focus on the most pertinent headlines dominating our world, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and what this means for our financial crime professionals working these issues. Over the past several weeks, the world's collective attention has been focused on everything Russia. Within the financial crime compliance industry, the biggest analyses have been regarding the removal of Russia from SWIFT as well as sanctions. In this episode, we bring on Ross Delston, attorney and expert witness, to shed light on the issues we haven't discussed yet in regard to Russia and the global financial industry. Ross, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for inviting me, Erin. It's great to be here.
Let's get right into it. Question number one, so much analysis has been performed in our industry regarding the sanctions against Russia. What is the top emerging risk that our industry hasn't been talking about so much about surrounding Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Well, I do a lot of work on fraud cases involving AML issues, looking for red flags, for example. And one of the types of risk that is most concerning that runs through these cases, the international cases, is geographic risk. Risk of geographies, locations of customers, wire transfers from offshore financial centers, OFCs, to and from onshore banks and other financial institutions and individuals. So geographic risk should always be, if you're a compliance officer, should always be front of mind. And when it comes to Russia, it has been high in terms of geographic risk, probably up there among the highest segment of high risk for many years, possibly forever, because Russia has been an autocracy dating back hundreds of years, maybe thousands. It's not just Putin. You can go back to Stalin and the czars. They all have secret police operations. They all were involved with censorship. That's not a good environment for the rule of law. So always difficult to do business in. And I'll read you the famous quote from Churchill, The Russian Enigma. This was a radio broadcast, 1939, where he says, "I cannot forecast to you the action of Russia." This is right at the start of World War II. "I cannot forecast to you the action of Russia. It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery, inside an enigma, but perhaps there is a key. That key is Russian national interest." So the riddle, enigma, wrapped mystery, everybody knows that. But the entire quote, national interest, yes, this war is in their national interest. So does that raise the geographic risk for all of us? Of course. Should it have been high to begin with? Yes. It always amazes me the number of US businesses that are doing business in Russia. You can't go to court there. You cannot go to court there. Good luck. So McDonald's is temporarily closing its Russian locations. Not surprising, they're pressured. And 847 restaurants in Russia with over 60,000 employees, who they say in this article, Wall Street Journal, they'll continue to pay. But not everybody's getting paid if you're an employee of any sort of consumer, retail, or any type of business in Russia. So geographic risk has just been raised even higher. Is it off the charts yet? Probably. And I don't just mean the war itself, but everything surrounding it. Erin?
You mentioned it's in their national interest. Given everything that they've been going through with the financial industry and the removal of SWIFT, and even talking about cryptocurrencies cutting off Russian entities, no matter who they are, what is the national interest for them? Can you explain that?
The national interest is Vladimir Putin. It's his personal interest. It is an autocracy. It is, Mr. Putin years ago referred to a dictatorship of law. No one knew what he meant. This is when he was viewed as a reformer. We then learned that, yeah, it's a dictatorship, not very much law. He decides everything. He sits at the end of a long table and decides what to do. He's fine. He's not hurting from the sanctions. Or ordinary Russians might be hurting. Oligarchs, he doesn't care about the oligarchs. Those are the courtiers who surround him. Those are not important people in the sense that you would see in other places. And then you add to that, this is a very different culture. I've been accused of being racist for talking about the fact that Russians are white and everybody in the West who is white looks at them and says, oh, they're just like us. They are not like us. I've been there 3 times, and I have Russian friends to this day. They are not like us. Their culture is they look at the world differently. And there's a huge amount of insecurity there. Always was, but any autocrat is inherently insecure. Why? Because he or she knows they cannot get elected. They're not there by popular demand. Putin wants to be popular, and I think he's tried to be popular. So, national interest, yes. Ukraine's on their border. Borders are really important, even in the 21st century. The US is surrounded by weak nations, Mexico and Canada. So we're okay. But Putin looks at the world that the West he feels invaded. NATO, the EU, all of that. So we'll talk, I hope, at the end about my suggestion or my view that's contrary to the conventional wisdom. But geographic risk, everything Russian.
And it's really important to have our financial crime professionals, no matter where you work inside a financial institution or crypto, anything, to learn about culture and to really bring that in and understand the history of why these transactions are happening within your bank. Is it zakat for a Middle Eastern country, and why 10% of their 10% of their paycheck goes to charity? That's the cultural you need to understand. Russian oligarchs, why are they paying certain things? So understanding that, you will understand more of the geographic risk. Is that what you're saying?
That's part of it, yes, and there are other parts of it too. What is Russia all about? It has the economic profile of a third world country. They mainly are exporting commodities, petroleum, of course, natural gas, of course, but also coal and steel and wheat. That's not a stable, strong economy in modern terms.
The geographic risk that you've been talking about, what about the other risks that the financial institutions face, like credit risk, legal, operational risk, interest rate risk? What about those? Can you speak to that?
Russian businesses, Russian individuals, and US banks have operations in Russia. US financial institutions MSBs are sending money and receiving money from Russia. There are, of course, all the consumer businesses like McDonald's and Pepsi who are there. Should they have been there? There's lots of reasons to be there, but you got to recognize the risk. So the first risk that I'd be looking at is credit risk. There was always a concern that you couldn't collect if you had a debt in Russia because the courts are corrupt, and the other side doesn't believe in courts. They believe in not the rule of law, but the rule of force. If you don't believe me, ask Bill Browder, the owner of the Hermitage company, which was taken over by a group of Russians, and then the Russian government, with the connivance of the Russian government, with the connivance of high officials in the Russian government, was defrauded through tax refunds. Browder has an excellent book called Red Notice that I recommend. Why do I focus on that aspect? Because I was an expert witness in a case called US v. Prevezon, hired by the Justice Department. And it's striking that they had to have the participation, the Russian fraudsters, not just of a few people, but of ministries, of courts, of the tax service. and they were all involved in this fraud. So what that tells me is some very high officials were aware of it and getting a piece of it. And that's the country we're talking about. One other thing, I really worry about the terminology that I hear people using. They talk about corporate raiders and then say, well, in Russia, it's different. It's not like in the US where there are proxy fights. These are not corporate raids. These are use of courts to take away companies in an illicit, illegal, corrupt way. So our terminology is wrong, I guess, is my point. We need to come up with new words and phrases to talk about Russia. So credit risk, definitely. What about operational and legal risk? Well, OFAC is constantly changing its view of Russia and its SDN list, and it's blocking sanctions. So is your vendor keeping up? Well, that's both a legal and an operational risk, because you get that wrong, you're going to court. OFAC's coming after you. If you're regulated, for example, by particularly the banking regulators, they're going to be asking questions about all this. So you better have your program in really good shape, including testing your own vendor to make sure they're up to date. So that's legal and operational. Interest rates have been gyrating, interest rate risk. Not an expert in interest rates, but that's got to worry everybody. I want to go back to credit risk for one more minute. The sanctions, and we seem to be heading toward a kind of blockade or embargo, the sanctions don't just hurt ordinary Russians. No question they do, and the oligarchs, okay, but they hurt every business in Russia. How are you going to buy or sell without SWIFT? How are you going to export or import spare parts? Russia doesn't make a lot of this stuff. There are a lot of businesses that are going to go under. Are any of them your counterparties? Because you got to worry about that. That's a credit risk issue. Would you have been worried before the invasion? Not as much. You should have been, but you wouldn't have been.
Nice. Thank you for all that. I know that you mentioned this earlier. You have a different take than most of the commentators on the war itself. Can you tell me more about that?
When the war started, we all, including me, were rooting for the Ukrainians. Like, isn't this great? And we're going to supply them with anti-aircraft missiles and all sorts of material. And it started to look like Afghanistan, which is where the Taliban and other groups and Osama bin Laden defeated the Soviet/Russian army with the help of the West. So the Russians are very sensitive about that. They withdrew eventually. My concern is not who wins or loses, because Russia's not pulling out. Their history in Afghanistan, their history in Chechnya, they don't pull out easily. 5 years, 10 years, who knows? Not anytime soon. So what does that mean? Should we still be supplying Ukraine, or should we be looking for a solution that I haven't seen anybody talk about, which is an Eastern European, former Soviet Switzerland? Yes, we'll help them economically, Ukraine, but they cannot join NATO. They will not join the EU ever, because that's what Putin is really worried about. Oh, aren't you giving in to Putin and you're coddling a dictator? You're not going to win this one through the military if you're supplying arms to a country like Ukraine. You're just not going to do it. And by the way, Ukraine is not exactly a bastion of democracy and rectitude. Their level of corruption, which unfortunately I can't talk about because I did work for an international financial institution in Ukraine, and therefore can't talk about publicly, but it is well known, highly corrupt in ways that you could not, or I did not before I went there 3 times, imagine, could not imagine.
Absolutely. Thank you for that different perspective. We here at ACFCS are always looking for different ways to look at the same problem so that we can give our financial crime professionals that added edge to what is it I'm looking for exactly. And you brought that really well, Ross. I really appreciate it. Last question. Let's give our listeners something to take back to their desks. There's always been a concern about PEPs. Given what you've just said and the current investigations and what's going on in Russia, what should they do when they're looking at PEPs at their financial institutions today?
One of the things that this whole Russian invasion of Ukraine has surfaced is the level of Russian involvement politically in the West. Best example, I'm not going to get into the US, so let's pick a more neutral country, the UK. Best example is Boris Johnson's Conservative Party. Huge contributions from Russian nationals who have dual citizenship in England. That's evidently allowable. Probably would be in this country as well, as long as you're a US citizen. So that means the donor is a PEP in the sense that they are involved in political activities. And of course, the recipient, Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party, are getting funds. Russia has supplied money to right-wing movements in places like France. So PEPs, always a high risk. PEPs in Russia, of course. But what about PEPs in the West who may have ties to Russian oligarchs? That's something that needs to be looked at, not just from a sanctions perspective, but is the PEP that you are lending to, that you are as a counterparty in a transaction, is that PEP entangled with Russia and getting funding and or other support from Russia?
Yeah, what is the risk that your financial institution is being exposed to by that individual, right?
There's no good answer, but you got to be looking.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Ross, for being a part of our Emerging Risks interviewee in this content series. To all of you viewing, please check out the ACFCS website when we post this for additional interviews on the ever-evolving situation in Ukraine. We will be keeping up this series. We'll be talking about other timely topics we'll need to explore within Emerging Risks interview series in general. Until then, keep up the good fight.
Thanks very much, Aaron.